Picture this. You're driving down a desolate stretch of Route 66 at dusk, your gas tank hovering near empty, when you spot a flickering neon sign for Highway Motel 66. The rates so cheap, they seem impossible in today's economy. You pull into the cracked asphalt parking lot, noticing how the other rooms all have faded blue doors, except for one at the far end, painted an unsettling shade of crimson that seems to pulse in the dying light. The elderly clerk hands you the key with trembling fingers, avoiding eye contact as he mumbles something about special guests and temporary arrangements. But exhaustion clouds your judgment, and you take it anyway. What would you do if you discovered the room you just checked into was never meant for someone with a beating heart? That crimson door would become the gateway to something far worse than a bad night's sleep. Sarah and Marcus were about to find out exactly why some deals are too good to be true, why certain doors should never be opened, and most importantly, why the living should never sleep where the dead still linger. Their backpacking adventure across America had been filled with stunning vistas and friendly locals. But Highway Motel 66 would teach them that some places exist between worlds, serving customers who check in but never truly check out. The moment they turned that tarnished brass key and stepped across the threshold of the room with the red door, the temperature dropped 20 degrees despite the desert heat outside, and the walls seemed to breathe with a rhythm that matched no living lung. Every instinct screamed at them to leave, but pride and exhaustion kept them there, setting up their sleeping bags on beds that felt like ice even through the moth-eaten blankets. By morning, if morning ever came, they would understand why the other guests they glimpsed through their window never seemed to move, never seemed to breathe, and why their own reflections in the cracked mirror were beginning to fade. If you're ready for more spine-chilling tales from the dark highways of America, hit that subscribe button and join us on this terrifying journey. The first hour in that cursed room passed like molasses dripping through broken glass, each second stretching into an eternity of unease, as Sarah tried to convince herself that the cold was just poor insulation and the strange breathing sounds were merely old pipes settling in the walls. But Marcus knew better. His military training had taught him to trust his instincts, and right now every nerve in his body was firing warning signals that they needed to leave immediately. The wallpaper, a faded floral pattern that might have been cheerful decades ago, seemed to shift and writhe in their peripheral vision, forming faces that disappeared the moment they turned to look directly at them, while the single overhead bulb flickered with a rhythm that matched no electrical fault they'd ever encountered, casting shadows that moved independently of their sources. Sarah unpacked their meager supplies with trembling hands, trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy. But when she opened the closet to hang their jackets, she found clothes already there. Vintage pieces from the 1950s that looked freshly pressed despite the dust that coated everything else in the room. And beneath them, a row of shoes arranged so perfectly that it seemed someone had just stepped out of them moments before. Marcus examined the bathroom and discovered that the mirror above the sink wasn't reflecting quite right, showing their images a half-second delayed, as if the glass itself was struggling to process their presence. And when he turned on the faucet, the water that sputtered out was ice cold and tinged with something dark that swirled down the drain before he could identify it. The beds themselves were the worst part, not just cold, but actively draining warmth from anything that touched them. And when Sarah sat down to test the mattress, she swore she felt something shift beneath the surface, something that moved with deliberate purpose, rather than the random settling of old springs. Outside their window, the parking lot had transformed into something otherworldly. The few cars they'd seen earlier now covered in a frost that couldn't exist in the desert heat. And through the windows of the other rooms, they could make out shapes that stood perfectly still. Silhouettes that never moved, never gestured, just stood there facing their direction as if waiting for something. Marcus tried his phone but found no signal, the screen flickering with the same unnatural rhythm as the overhead light, displaying text messages he'd never received from numbers that couldn't exist, all saying the same thing over and over. You shouldn't be here while you're still breathing. The walls began to emit a smell, like old copper and wet earth, growing stronger as the night deepened. And Sarah noticed that their reflections in the cracked mirror were becoming more transparent with each passing minute, as if they were slowly being erased from reality itself. And when she touched the glass, her hand passed through it slightly, feeling a cold so intense it burned. They tried to leave then, both of them grabbing their bags and rushing to the door. But the handle wouldn't turn, the lock mechanism clicking and grinding with sounds that resembled whispered words in a language neither of them recognized. And through the peephole, they saw the elderly clerk standing in the parking lot, his eyes now solid black, pointing at their room and mouthing words they couldn't hear but somehow understood. The red door chose you, and checkout time is never. The temperature continued to plummet as midnight approached, their breath now visible in the air despite the desert heat that should have been seeping through the thin walls. And Sarah watched in horror as frost began spreading across the inside of the windows, forming intricate patterns that looked disturbingly like skeletal hands reaching inward. Marcus pounded on the door with increasing desperation, his fists leaving bloody marks on the wood that immediately absorbed into the grain, like the door was feeding on his life force. While behind them, the television they hadn't noticed before flickered to life on its own, displaying grainy black and white footage of their own room from impossible angles, showing them sleeping in the beds they hadn't yet touched. The footage was dated from different years spanning decades, always showing different people in the same room, all of them gradually becoming more transparent until they simply vanished, leaving only their shadows burned into the walls like nuclear silhouettes. And Sarah realized with sickening clarity that those shadows were still there, barely visible in the corners where the wallpaper had peeled away. The breathing sounds in the walls grew louder and more distinct, resolving into whispered conversations between voices that sounded both ancient and freshly dead, discussing the new arrivals in tones of hunger and anticipation, while the floral wallpaper began to bloom with actual moisture, dripping a substance that looked like blood, but moved with conscious purpose across the floor. Marcus grabbed a chair and smashed it against the window. But the glass didn't shatter. Instead, it rippled like water. And through the distortion, they saw the parking lot was now filled with translucent figures, all previous guests of the Red Room, wandering aimlessly with hollow eyes, their mouths moving in silent screams as they tried desperately to warn the living while being unable to cross back over the threshold they'd once foolishly entered. The beds began to sink into the floor as if the room itself was digesting them, revealing underneath a surface of what appeared to be breathing flesh, pulsing with veins that glowed with an otherworldly bioluminescence. And Sarah felt her feet beginning to stick to the carpet, as if it was trying to root her in place, to make her part of the room's eternal collection. She grabbed the Gideon Bible from the nightstand in desperation. But the pages were blank, except for a single repeated phrase, written in what looked like dried blood. The living are just visitors here, but the dead are permanent residents. And as she read it aloud, the room seemed to shudder with pleasure, the walls contracting like a throat preparing to swallow. Marcus noticed their backpacks were decomposing rapidly, years of decay happening in seconds, their clothes turning to dust, their phones crumbling to rust, time itself accelerating around them while they remained trapped in an endless moment of terror. And through it all, the mirror kept showing their reflections growing fainter, their bodies becoming translucent as the room claimed them bit by bit, molecule by molecule, memory by memory, until they understood that checkout time wasn't just never. It was a concept that ceased to exist once you became part of Highway Motel 66's permanent collection of souls. Sarah's scream pierced through the supernatural cacophony as she watched Marcus's hand pass completely through the doorknob, his flesh becoming translucent like wet tissue paper. And in that moment of pure terror, she noticed the elderly clerk standing in the doorway that hadn't been there before, his form solid and real, watching them with eyes that held centuries of witnessed horror, finally speaking in a voice like grinding stone. "You shouldn't have taken the red room." But then again, they always do, drawn like moths to flame, never understanding that some doors open only one way, into places where the living become currency for debts older than this desert. The clerk's body began to shift and contort, revealing his true nature as something that had never been human, merely wearing the disguise of mortality to lure travelers into this dimensional trap. And as his skin peeled away like old paint, underneath was a writhing mass of shadows and starlight, beautiful and terrible in equal measure, speaking now in multiple voices of all the previous victims. Highway Motel 66. This exists in the spaces between heartbeats, in the pause between life and death, feeding on the transition, the moment when hope turns to despair, when flesh becomes spirit, when the living realize they've already begun to die. The room started to rotate slowly, gravity becoming meaningless as Sarah and Marcus found themselves walking on walls, the ceiling, reality folding in on itself, while through the windows they could see not the desert, but an infinite corridor of identical red doors, each one opening to reveal the same room they were trapped in, creating a nauseating, recursive loop of imprisonment that stretched into infinity. Marcus tried to speak, but his voice came out as the same whispered conversations they'd heard in the walls, his words already becoming part of the room's eternal dialogue. And Sarah realized with crystalline horror that they weren't being killed. They were being absorbed, transformed into part of the motel's living architecture. Their consciousness spread thin across every molecule of wood and plaster, condemned to feel every future guest's footsteps, to witness every new victim's terror while being powerless to warn them. The television showed them their own future, standing translucent in the parking lot, trying to scream warnings at a young couple pulling up in a dusty sedan. And then the image shifted to show their past, revealing they'd been driving in circles for hours before arriving, the motel calling to them through subliminal whispers in the radio static, manipulating their route, their choices, their very thoughts to bring them here. The clerk's form solidified again, now standing inches from Sarah's face, his breath smelling of formaldehyde and desert roses as he whispered the final truth. Every ghost story you've ever heard about Route 66 originated here, in this room. Because this is where stories come to die and nightmares are born, where the highway feeds its darkest hungers. And you, my dear guests, are about to become our newest cautionary tale. Whispered at truck stops and diners, warning travelers about the motel with rates too good to be true, and the room with the red door that should never, ever be opened. The transformation began slowly at first, Sarah's fingernails turning black as they elongated into the floorboards, becoming part of the room's wooden anatomy, while Marcus's eyes filled with the same flickering static from the television. His pupils reflecting endless corridors of red doors as his body started to merge with the wallpaper, his skin taking on its faded floral pattern. And through their shared agony, they understood this was how the motel sustained itself, feeding on the life force of travelers, using their essence as mortar between dimensions. The elderly clerk circled them like a vulture, his form shifting between human and cosmic horror, as he explained in a voice that sounded like breaking glass. Highway Motel 66 was built on a dimensional fracture in 1947, the same year of the Roswell incident, not by human hands, but by entities that needed a feeding ground, a Venus flytrap along America's Mother Road. And every soul trapped here strengthens the barrier between what should be and what must never be, keeping things far worse than death from spilling into your world. Sarah felt her memories being extracted like teeth, each one becoming a photograph on the walls that weren't there before, showing her childhood, her first kiss, her college graduation, all fading to sepia, then to nothing, as the room digested her past. And she watched helplessly as Marcus's form became increasingly transparent, his outline blurring until he was just another shadow among thousands writhing in the corners. The temperature continued to plummet until their breath crystallized in the air, forming ice patterns on surfaces that spelled out names of previous victims, dates going back decades. And Sarah recognized some from missing person reports she'd seen in gas stations along Route 66. Understanding now that they'd all made the same fatal mistake of choosing the cheapest room. The one with the red door that pulsed like a heart because it was a heart. The motel's hungry heart that beat with stolen life. Through her fading vision, Sarah saw the truth of their situation reflected in every surface. They had been dead since the moment they'd turned the key, their bodies discovered days ago in their car at the rest stop 50 miles back, carbon monoxide poisoning from a faulty exhaust. And this motel, this room, this horror was their transition point, not from life to death, but from death to something far worse. An eternal servitude as part of the motel's hunting mechanism. The clerk's laughter filled the room like poisonous smoke as he revealed the cruelest truth of all. You see, my dear fading guests, Highway Motel 66 doesn't just trap souls. It uses them as bait, their residual humanity calling out to other travelers through dreams and suggestions, creating an endless cycle where the victims become the victimizers. And soon you'll find yourselves standing behind this desk, wearing my face, welcoming the next exhausted couple with promises of rest and rates too good to refuse. Completing the circle that has turned for 7 decades along this cursed stretch of America's most famous road. Marcus's last coherent thought before complete dissolution was the realization that the red door wasn't just painted that color, but was stained with the accumulated essence of every soul who'd crossed its threshold, each layer adding to its hypnotic pulse. And as his consciousness scattered into the motel's neural network, he felt the presence of hundreds of others, all screaming silently in the walls, in the pipes, in the very air that future guests would breathe. Their collective agony powering the dimensional engine that kept Highway Motel 66 anchored between worlds. Sarah watched her own hands becoming translucent, seeing through them to the floor beneath where previous victims' bones had been ground into the foundation. Their calcium forming runes that spelled out contracts in languages that predated human speech. And she understood that checking into the room was signing away not just life, but existence itself, becoming fuel for something that fed on the transition between states of being. The elderly clerk's form split into multiple versions of himself, each one a different decade of his servitude. from a young man in 1947, discovering the motel's true nature to the hollow thing he'd become. And through this temporal cascade, Sarah saw that he too had once been a traveler, had once turned a red key, had once screamed as she was screaming now. The sound absorbed by walls that converted terror into sustenance. Outside, new headlights swept across the parking lot. Another exhausted couple drawn by the impossibly cheap rates and the subconscious call of trapped souls broadcasting their distress like a psychic beacon along Route 66's electromagnetic field. And Sarah felt herself involuntarily smiling, her face muscles controlled by the motel's will, preparing to become part of the welcoming committee for fresh victims. The room's crimson walls began secreting a substance that looked like blood, but moved with purpose, coating Sarah and Marcus's dissolving forms, preserving them in a state of perpetual transformation, never fully dead, never fully absorbed. Hanging in the agonizing space between existence and void, where consciousness remained intact, but control was forever lost. Through the static-filled television, images of their own deaths played on loop, showing them suffocating in their car over and over. But each replay revealed new details. The motel's sign visible in the distance, calling to them even as they died, their souls already being reeled in like fish on an invisible line. Their physical deaths merely the beginning of their true journey into Highway Motel 66's digestive system. The transformation completed as Sarah felt her individuality shatter into fragments, each piece becoming a different function of the motel. Her empathy turned into the lure that would attract kind-hearted travelers. Her memories became the dreams that would haunt guests in other rooms. Her fear crystallized into the cold spots that would make people huddle under blankets that offered no warmth. And her love for Marcus became the tragic energy that would make couples hold each other tighter, never knowing they were embracing their own doom. While somewhere in the walls, Marcus's essence was undergoing the same horrific metamorphosis, their souls forever intertwined in the motel's predatory architecture. Two more names added to the ledger of Highway Motel 66. Two more voices in the chorus of the damned that sang along America's Mother Road. The red door remains there still, waiting along that desolate stretch of Route 66, its crimson surface pulsing with the accumulated essence of Sarah, Marcus, and countless others who mistook desperation for opportunity, exhaustion for acceptable risk. And somewhere behind that door, their consciousness persists in eternal torment, experiencing every second of dissolution while simultaneously serving as bait for the next weary travelers whose headlights will inevitably sweep across that parking lot. The elderly clerk continues his eternal shift, his trembling hands dispensing keys to rooms that exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously, his hollow eyes reflecting the knowledge that Highway Motel 66 isn't just a business, but a living organism that feeds on the transition between life and death, between hope and despair, between the physical world and the void that hungers beneath America's most iconic highway. Each night brings new victims drawn by prices that shouldn't exist, by a subconscious pull they can't explain, by the collective psychic scream of trapped souls that registers only as a vague unease until it's far too late, until they've crossed that threshold and felt the temperature drop, until they've laid down on beds that feel like morgue slabs and noticed their reflections beginning to fade. The motel grows stronger with each feeding, its influence spreading along Route 66 like a cancer through asphalt veins, creating dead zones where reality thins and the barrier between worlds becomes permeable, where other motels begin displaying impossible rates, where other doors start shifting from blue to red, where the epidemic of disappearances is explained away as highway statistics, while something ancient and hungry expands its hunting ground across America's heartland. One cheap room, one red door, one dissolved soul at a time.